Mr. Ryder was astute, noticing that after Mr. Brooks being in his home for maybe 8 to 9 minutes, he saw squads driving by. I think you could say his gut told him something wasn't right. And he had Mr. Brooks go onto the porch, of course, after having given him a sandwich, given him a coat to wear. Ultimately asks him for his coat back, and then, of course, the arrest. This is where some of the lies become evident. Mr. Brooks claims ultimately when he's being interviewed by Detective Carpenter, they have to actually seek medical clearance for him because he claims that he was thrown to the ground when he was arrested. He was not. The video is very clear. He cooperated. He laid down. There was no use of force used at all to take him into custody. But we know ultimately that he lies about what he was doing in Waukesha, how he got there, who he was with. He lies about having contact with Erica Patterson the day before. We know when he's found, he has the Ford Key credit card, not only in his name, but one, whether it's a credit card or like a benefits card, but it's in the name of Erica Patterson, and of course an ID for himself, a state-issued ID. The Ford itself is registered in his mom's name. It's the same address that's on his ID, and there was documentation found in the Ford Escape. He's now in custody. He's taken to the substation, ultimately taken to Waukesha Memorial Hospital. What's notable about the video and audio clips that this court reviewed from the hospital, Mr. Brooks is calm. He's coherent. There's no obvious signs of impairment, no obvious signs or really any signs of mental distress. He makes statements that he's not from the area. He doesn't appear disoriented or confused. At some point, there's kind of a jovial atmosphere between him and one of the detectives. The next day, he lies to Detective Carpenter, denies driving to Waukesha. I got a ride. He makes up the story about a tan Kia. He's very nondescript and vague with the information that he provides. And over the course of those 5 hours, he never once references the parade. He never once says there was another driver. Of course, they start talking to him initially about the domestic altercation because by that time it's very clear a link had been made between Erica Patterson and the call that police originally received of the domestic, or at least an altercation near Frame Park, and Mr. Brooks. We also know, because of the bond conditions in the 2 felony cases, he's not supposed to have any contact with her whatsoever, but he does. At no time during the 5 hours on November 22nd does he make any admissions. Does he show any concern for any of the victims? No empathy, only lies, only concern for himself, for his family. Can I have a phone call? He does not provide, and I said this already, the name of anyone else that could be driving that vehicle. At one point, Detective Carpenter says, one of 2 people drove through the Waukesha Christmas parade. Either a God-fearing person who screwed up or the malicious guy. Darrell Brooks' response is, don't spin it. One of the things that has become abundantly clear throughout this trial, Darrell Brooks understands exactly what he's doing. His comprehension is fine. I have absolutely no concerns and have never had any concerns throughout this case and throughout this trial, or even through the past day and a half regarding his competency. He's intelligent, he's deliberate, he's purposeful. He made nuanced arguments during this trial, one about the right to counsel versus the right to the assistance of counsel. That's a sophisticated legal argument, not the product of someone who doesn't understand. He asked questions on cross regarding tint, horns. He brought up the recall after the fact. He talked and asked questions about, question about barricades, police being at the intersection. Although we never fully understood what his defense was, what became very apparent to me as I reread through all of my notes is that from the very beginning, he wanted to argue jury nullification. If you go back to his opening statements, he talked about power and the jury doing the right thing. He repeated that theme during his closing statement. At one point, he objected to evidence based upon a violation of one of the court's pretrial rulings. Again, a pretty sophisticated objection that resulted in the court striking an exhibit that had previously been received. Today, he spent close to 2 hours talking on his own behalf without any notes. He covered a variety of topics. I want to talk next about, here's my note that I found. One more thing on Mr. Brooks. You know, at times, right, we've seen the eye rolling, the fake clapping, the laughing, hand gestures, many times and most times very emotionless, unless he's doing those things, which would be really inappropriate and are inappropriate. His reactions are largely negative when things are not going his way. What did this community suffer as a result of this tragedy, this malicious conduct by Mr. Brooks? Well, I think many of the victims who spoke said it best. Lori Locken described it as this: a sense of personal safety you robbed from us. I believe it was Bill Mitchell who said, the only life he seems to value is his own. Jason referred to it as evil. And he talked about innocence being stolen. He called the defendant a coward. No remorse. What he said is, you look like a monster. You look disrespectful to court and witnesses. You look like a callous jerk. But I forgive you. Such character. Such compassion. Margaret talked about the mental, physical, and emotional toll this has taken. She talked about how it was so traumatizing that her mind won't let her see everything that has happened, and that she's worried when her mind might allow her to do that. I'm thankful that she's 95% back to normal. She talked about emotionally every day she's reminded of the physical pain and the loss of self. But she has had tremendous support from family and friends, and that today she will move on. Jeff Rogers also commented on the lack of remorse and sympathy for the victims, how he has had to relive just the immenseness of this, the confusion, the anxiety, depression as a father, and irritation. He talked about how his son, Caden, was so concerned for his younger sister. I'm really glad Riley is okay. I believe that was from the day of the parade. and how he recognized he was inches away from losing 3 of his 4 kids just because of where they were located. He had flashbacks of grabbing his daughter's jacket, missing the first time, but that Riley gets up sometimes 6, 7, 8 times a night. How this was supposed to be a happy kickoff event for him as their new president, and how after it happened and in the aftermath, the weight of the moment, and 35 people there trying to find everyone, weighed on him. He talked about the media showing up at his door and the emotional toll things have taken. It was intense, and speaking at Jackson's funeral. He talked about how his faith is stronger. Again, very gracious, very inspiring. We heard next from Jessica and Juan, and how this impacted them, the loss of their son's friend Jackson. Their kids were involved in 2 different groups that day. One a dance group, not the extreme dance group, but a different one. And then, of course, the Blazers. And how, I believe it was Jessica who said, I yelled stop. I put my hands out as if I had the power. How she saw Jackson and how she will forever have that image burned in her memory. And that she was so grateful when she found her son. How she covered his eyes to shield him from what was around. Not once, but twice they had to run, because at first it was what happened through the parade, and then the active shooter situation, because of obviously people didn't know who had fired the shots in that moment, and she talked about pain and terror. Many people talked about PTSD. I mean, for her, I was really struck by how difficult it has been because of what she saw, not able to be a teacher, how she's hypervigilant, and every sound sends her into a panic, how her joy has been stolen, and how she does her best to hold it together for her kids. But when she was alone, she cried, she screamed, and only a month ago was she able to return to work, but in a very different capacity. She commented on the lack of remorse by Mr. Brooks, and that he seems to search only for sympathy for himself. She said he will always be a danger to society. We heard from more individuals. From the Blazers, again, a lot of discussion of PTSD. The sights and sounds of the SUV plowing through, the impact to her and the kids, the nightmares, how parking lots are problems, there's panic attacks, that no one will ever be the same. Of course, we heard next from the Sparks family. They're hurt, angry, they're traumatized, they're broken. It was difficult to even watch them make their statements. Their hurt is palpable. She talked about her last hug with Jackson, the horrible sounds she heard. She saw a police officer holding Jackson. She went to Tucker, and that her world came crashing down. She talked about how she found a hat, both boys' hats, then shoes. Again, I didn't realize how significantly Tucker had been injured until she described that for us yesterday. How Tucker somehow blames himself for his brother's death. It's not your fault, Tucker. It's Mr. Brooks's fault. One of the things when there is a fatality with all of these victims is the future that is robbed from them, right? No future weddings, no future graduations, no future grandchildren or children, no plans. It's just gone. It's all memories. And the contrast with, frankly, what Mr. Brooks will have, and that is even a life in prison, he'll make memories, he'll have phone calls, he'll have visits. He may even get to hug the people that he loves again. For the 6 individuals who lost their lives, that will never, ever be a reality. And that this family also talked about the lack of empathy, lack of remorse, no apology. I'm aware Mr. Brooks wants to come back. It says, I don't intend to interrupt in any way. That's not a pledge. He needs to pledge that he will not do so. I need that word in that statement. And if he does that, I'll bring him back in. I'm going to try to go a little bit faster. Some of the comments. The yells and screams from that night will haunt me for the rest of my life. I'm asking the court to give the max for each conviction because he has given the community a life sentence of these memories. I think it was Tyler's mom who talked about the community rising like a phoenix. You clearly have a phoenix for a son. He's strong. He got me a little bit with his comments. Wasn't expecting that. You're an amazing young man. You're a picture of resiliency, of fortitude, of strength. I think what this community needs. I thought it was quite a testament that you took those pictures and the same pictures of Jackson, you replicated that, and I thought that was a great tribute to him. You talked about, of course, rising up with Eric, who had significant injuries as well, both of you, and how you fought back and each were able to play baseball, even if not up to the full capacity that you had done previously. And then we next heard from Sasha, who's haunted by survivor guilt. My heart breaks for her. She talked about feeling empty, how she couldn't play soccer because her kicking leg would hurt from the injuries she sustained. She has difficulty sleeping, struggles with nightmares. Physically and emotionally, she feels stuck. She talked about maybe law school being in her future. And to her, I say, don't give him the satisfaction of holding you back. Rely on your friends and your family and be the phoenix that Tyler's mom spoke about. Jen Dunn read a statement from Sasha's mom, and I wrote this down. No one knows what it's like to stand on your feet when there is no floor. That's a pretty powerful image. I think that's very apt for what this community has gone through. We heard from others, including the Teagues. We saw photographs. So many families with more than one individual who was injured. How baseball for Eric was stolen, how he was such a good player. We heard a lot about night terrors and, again, PTSD and trauma, One of the individuals talked about humor is good medicine, and I would echo that. We heard about one band member whose instrument may have very well saved his life. Someone described it as a mental massacre, though, the aftermath of this. It's difficult to go downtown. It's difficult to get restful slumber. Panic attacks are common. Describe Mr. Brooks as sheer evil in its vilest form. I wrote down that despite all of the impact and carnage, many people talked about forgiveness, brokenness, sorrow, anger, hatred, regret. A lot of emotions, frankly, really no emotion shown by Mr. Brooks, certainly not for what he did on November 21st. We saw a lot of anger for some of the people who lost loved ones, and understandably so. Many families were devastated. Nannies and grandmas were taken away. Yes, there were very specific terms used to describe Mr. Brooks, that in their opinion, he's a monster, he's a demon. Pure, unrepentant evil was one of the phrases that were used. Talked about the system failing us. Saw you in your SUV hanging out with a smile of satisfaction on your face. For one of Leanna Owen's sons, I lost my mom, and I wasn't always a good son. You can hear, right, the regret in that statement, because life is short, and these lives were taken far too short. We heard the very gracious statement from Michael Carlson, who, unbeknownst to me, had been writing Mr. Brooks in jail and sharing the gospel and the love of Jesus. He read a poem, which I thought was beautiful, from the standpoint of his sister. And he said this. In that poem, it says, "We both died that day. I, Tamara, died to life. You died to the world." And then, of course, the Sorensen family talked next. They talked about never seeing their Grammy again. You murdered my mom. But at least I have some peace knowing she died doing something she loved. We heard from Brooke yesterday and today. She reread her statement due to the interruption. Proud of her for getting up here and sharing that. We talked about how compassionate each one of these individuals who died were. We heard about the compassion from Detective Casey that we learned about. It said Detective Casey came to our home to verify what we knew, and he greeted us every day of this trial. They ended with, "Angels watch over us." 6 angels watching over us today. They asked me to hold Mr. Brooks accountable so that he will not have the opportunity to hurt anyone ever again. We heard from the Kulik family about the empty space that they have and the brokenness. Their lives being shattered by mom and grandma being taken away. We heard from her youngest daughter among them. The grief was so palpable, being 17 and in high school as a senior, now a first year in college. She talked about all of the things she will never have with her mom. Just the last year alone, an 18th birthday for her and her brother, graduation, and beginning college. She lamented that her mom would never see her do her wedding vows, never see any kids that she would have, be a grandmother. She wouldn't be able to call her mom for parenting advice. And how excruciating it was for that family to wait 3 hours because of the chaos at the hospital. Talked about triggers of their PTSD, sirens, things of that nature. And how she waited. She waited hoping that Darrell Brooks would have a reason. She also said this, verdicts don't bring my mom back. No more hugs, no more dinners, no more talks. My mom was the glue that kept our family together, and we are falling apart. Moving on, Leanne talked about her safety and security being stolen by this defendant. She asked Mr. Brooks to picture his own daughter, unresponsive, lying on the ground with a leg injury, a head injury, and blood coming out of her mouth. She talked about the excruciating 2 weeks in the hospital, wondering if her daughter would ever live, in a wheelchair and then a walker for months. She said this, all you had to do was hit the brakes. Her daughter talked about being scared of everything, worried about a sister, being alone in a church for 3 hours on lockdown because of what was happening in the aftermath. And we heard next from the Urell family. A family that, of course, was impacted significantly with 4 of their children, all of their children being struck by the SUV, with the mom, of course, having to testify, in this case being called by Mr. Brooks, which, of course, was his right to call witnesses. But it's the manner in which, I think the indifference, not caring that this was someone who had 4 children impacted significantly. But clearly, you're raising your kids the right way. With grace and dignity, Charlotte got up and talked about the basic things you learned in kindergarten. She described what she saw as being stupid, delusional, and egotistical. She wanted to punch you in the face, and understandably so. I think her words were, "Your arrogance is pathetic," and her mom echoed those words. And then the gut-wrenching survivor guilt that you heard from her mom. She goes, "I say this with a heavy heart. I have my kids here. I had to fight for my children. They will strive." And then, of course, we heard from Alyssa, her heart-wrenching statement. She, of course, testified bravely, but you could tell the impact that this had on her and what she saw in the aftermath to the extreme dance team. How one of the girls, who at 10 years old, even lying on the ground being injured, had the wherewithal to ask, why would someone do this? If a 10-year-old knew this, then the defendant knew this. And how she left the hospital not knowing if she would see some of her girls again. She was completely and utterly broken, forever changed by this event. She waited. She talked about how she waited for remorse, for empathy. It didn't happen. Dylan Urell said something very insightful yesterday, something we didn't hear about in the trial, but because of where he was at on the parade route, around the corner, waiting for his children, He didn't even know that all of them were in the parade. He said this: you hit the brakes to go around the corner. And then you drove through a barricade where an officer shot at you 3 times. Those brakes were working. You knew how to use them. And you selfishly only used them so as to not crash your own vehicle as you fled the scene. Talked about walking through and around that corner through the wake of carnage, bodies all over, women, adults, children deceased, people running all over. We heard from more of the members of the extreme dance team, either directly or parents and loved ones, how they had to walk through the carnage to find their children. Such a gracious statement of love, talking to Mr. Brooks about being a Christian and how she prays for him. Very powerful. Thank you for that. Her daughter, equally as powerful and brave and gracious. But even she knew, she said, I thought about you every day. How could someone do this? More victims talking about PTSD. How even the song that was playing during the extreme dance team performance is a trigger for her PTSD. And how she's forgiven him. We heard from the sister of victim HH and how the first thing she talked about was the sound of Vivian Urell whimpering, crying, and then she found her sister, how her clothes were ripped off. She was unconscious, half naked. How she felt forgotten because her mom was at the hospital with her sister, of course, due to the severity of her injuries. How her sister was in a coma for 2 weeks, but how she has survivor guilt and issues like that, panic attacks, PTSD. She can't be around fireworks, tires screeching is a trigger. That this turned her life upside down. And then, of course, we heard from victim HH herself. So brave to come here. I'm so very thankful you are recovering. Someone commented on how amazing it is to see the many people in recovery. You wouldn't know by looking at them, of course. The emotional and mental injuries are significant and severe, but so grateful. Frankly, lucky to be alive. I say to you, that scar on your neck should be a sign of strength and fortitude. You fought, you won. You have a story to tell. Don't shy away from it. Of course, we heard from her mother as well. We saw that PowerPoint with the pictures of their journey. The road rash on her face was horrific. You can only get a mental picture from words so much, but to see those actual pictures, her being intubated, and it's heart-wrenching. And all of the surgeries and the toll it took on their family. But she described her daughter as a warrior. I think all of you here are warriors. We heard from Sam and her family and what she went through and how significant her injuries were. And her mom talked about the haunting vision she has of just what she saw because of her perspective. Sitting in the back of the pickup truck, she had a front row seat to horror. How she thought her daughter was dead because she was unresponsive, and blood, and really kind of the chaos and the confusion, and not really even being able to articulate what happened over the phone to her husband. She described what happened as careless and reckless. Asking Mr. Brooks, how could you do this? What kind of father does that? The last person we heard from was victim, I think it's Gigi, the mother of FF. If I have it reversed, please excuse me. And how I actually have her written statement that was provided earlier today, but how she was so taken aback by the conduct of Mr. Brooks that she frankly called him out on it yesterday, because he was kind of motioning his hand like, okay, come on, let's get this over with, hurry up. She yelled at him, you don't care. She goes, you hit me, I saw you, you knew, you're a child killer, you're a woman killer. She was so flustered, she had to really gather herself before she could continue. So again, I want to thank the victims. I have other statements that I've read for people, so gracious. I think they were all members of the Catholic communities. Their statements were translated, very gracious, praying for Mr. Brooks. So I just wanted you all to know that I've taken all of these statements into consideration today. I can't read your sign, Mr. Brooks. Can you hold it up closer? If it's a pledge that you will not interrupt me, I will bring you in for what will be the final section of my remarks today in the sentencing portion.
Judge, I think you should give him that opportunity before you go through
I'll do that.
sentencing factors. And I can only read the top where it says objection, but
I can't tell what it is, what it says. He can bring the sign with. We'll clear the courtroom. We'll take a short break, and I will bring him back in. But I will warn you, Mr. Brooks, if there is one interruption, you will go back to that room because you will forfeit your right to be present for the sentencing portion. We'll be in recess until we can get him back in. Thank you.